Oh, thank you so much for being here and for having me here. And I have to say, historical societies are my favorite audiences because I've never been booed about Sir John A. Macdonald yet. Historical audience, so I historical society audience. I think it's funny because I actually spoke to the Canada Club in Oakville a couple of years ago, and I got to the point where there was so much bad press about Sir John A. Macdonald I was anticipating. And I said something at one point, somebody asked me how I felt, and I said, well, I think revising history is, there's no lessons to be learned from revising history. I said, I think everybody, throughout the history of civilization, there has been conquering of civilizations, and it's awful and appalling. But I think that John A. Macdonald had good intentions, essentially, and I think he was a man of his era, as were all the people who voted him in over and over and over 7 times. So we're all culpable. And I had no idea exactly what I said, but I got a standing ovation, because it turns out the Canada Club is so committed to history and to Sir John A. Macdonald. So now and then you hit a receptive audience. But I've written quite a bit about him because what happened was I wasn't interested at all in politics, but I am really interested in food, and I'm really interested in culinary history, or as I've taken to calling it, culinary archaeology, because I think we can rebuild it. And I think that it's I'm particularly interested in pre-industrial food, and there are so many fantastic lessons that we've lost and forgotten, and I think it's really important we don't, because culinary history is a fundamental part of history. It's so important. So for me, what happened was I was researching in the area just for my own interest, and I realized that because he was Prime Minister, the first Prime Minister of Canada, the archives were full of information about, like crazy things, like the dockets that came to his door, the delivery dockets, so you could see what food he'd had. You could see he'd had olive oil delivered, and cans of anchovies, and things that we wouldn't have known. And for, those records don't exist for normal people. So he was a great gateway to tell a story about culinary history. And actually, I'm here with both books. I want to read a really short excerpt from both. I don't want to bore you, so you can, if it starts getting tedious, just shout out. Feel free. and I think we're just going to have discussion. And I do have slides, but I feel like the slides, it's far more interesting to have a discussion. And as soon as we put slides up, or at least in my case, as soon as slides go up, I find that everybody just shuts up and doesn't get into a discussion. So what I'd really like to do is do a couple of short passages and a little bit of discussion and lots of questions from you and whatever you're interested in. But I think the scope of this is wider than anybody thinks, and my contention is the stories are the real stories of our lives and the most fundamental aspect of history. So start with Sir John's Table. I'm going to read a little bit from, sorry, am I?
A bit louder.
A bit louder? Okay, is that better?
Or maybe step forward would
step
also
forward
do it.
And shout out or put your hands up or whatever it is you want to do if you can't hear me, because I might forget. Okay, this is chapter 1, Passage to Upper Canada, Bring Your Own Biscuits, 1815 to 1820. John A. Macdonald was just 4 years old when he made his first public speech. While his parents were hosting visitors in the sitting room, the children were sent to the kitchen to occupy themselves out of sight of the adults. John A. promptly climbed atop the kitchen table and began a performance for his captive audience of siblings and friends. In between his words and his wild gesticulations, with both his arms and his legs involved, he managed to propel himself off the table, landing on a chair and gashing his forehead badly enough that the resulting scar was still visible upon his death. Perhaps his early precociousness was the reason his mother, Helen Shaw Macdonald, was so fond of saying, "Mark my words, John will make more than the ordinary man." In June 1820, a year after John A.'s maiden speech and 2 years after the 49th parallel had been named the border between British North America and the United States, Hugh and Helen Macdonald gathered their belongings and their 4 children, Margaret, John A., James, and Louisa, along with an orphaned cousin, Maria, and Hugh Macdonald's elderly, frail mother, and set sail for the New World. They were leaving Scotland aboard the Earl of Buckinghamshire, destined for the old port of Quebec, and finally their new home in Upper Canada. The Macdonalds traveled below deck in steerage class alongside the majority of the ship's other 350 passengers. For 42 days, the 8 MacDonald family members endured no privacy except that provided by a lice-riddled blanket they suspended around their 1.5 meter square area. Stacked with bunk beds that constituted their home during the Atlantic crossing. The only toilets on the ship were 2 privies. There was a dearth of food. The poorly ventilated steerage compartments were sour with the pungent smell of unwashed bodies, damp, dirty clothes, a lack of sanitation, sewage, sweat, and vomit, and rotting food. Many of the passengers were desperately seasick. Others had dysentery and respiratory infections. There was no source of light or fresh air other than what filtered in through cracks. The only water for washing was seawater. Rats were rampant. Everything was damp and dirty, and at times the passengers sloshed through filthy water underfoot. Sorry. Those early overcrowded vessels were known as coffin ships because so many people died on board. It was not until 1847 that modest sanitation regulations were put in place to increase the likelihood of safe passage on ocean-going vessels. Even so, steerage passengers were lucky if there was 1 privy to every 100 passengers and adequate fresh water for drinking. I mean, it's just phenomenal. The circumstances were so horrible. Food in steerage consisted primarily of watered-down oatmeal and molasses, hardtack, and dubious unsavory stews often made with horse meat or the leftovers from the first and second class dining rooms. There was no dining room for steerage class. Passengers lined up for their food, doled from huge kettles into dinner pails. The bread was often moldy and virtually inedible, and it was not an unknown practice for captains to deliberately feed the steerage passengers food that would make them ill, so they would not demand
that practice is done.
Full rations. I didn't demand rations coming over.
They used to have it.
Yeah. You wouldn't have been that sort of captain.
No, absolutely.
After 42 harsh days at sea, the Earl of Buckinghamshire arrived at Quebec City and its weary passengers disembarked. The second part of the MacDonald's journey was almost as hard as the first. They traveled up the St. Lawrence River aboard bateaux and Durham boats which were open to the elements and sometimes under sail, but more often poled, pushed, or pulled, and sometimes dragged by both men and oxen. At night, they hauled the boats ashore and slept alongside the river. They lacked any kind of adequate sanitation or shelter. They cooked their meals on open fires and slept as best they could amidst the mosquitoes and wildlife, though they were likely too tired to care. Though there are varying accounts of the duration of this second stage of the journey to Kingston, one thing is certain. The MacDonald family were in transit for at least 9 weeks from the time they left Scotland, a journey that would now take closer to 9 hours and still elicit serious grumbling. In this period, Kingston was rough and rude and had a reputation for debauchery. And since we're here on Wolf Island, I can say that I think this is probably still the case. It was a town rife with drunkards and prostitutes. It was also one of the most important settlements in Upper Canada because of its strategic location at the intersection of the St. Lawrence River and the Great Lakes. It was larger than York, which was later to become Toronto. With a population of about 3,500, Kingston was home to Fort Henry, a naval shipyard, some handsome and substantial homes, some good schools, shops, St. Andrews, a Presbyterian church, a newspaper, and at least 78 taverns. And I'm going to hold that book there. So what I did in this book was I divided every chapter into 2 parts, one where I talk about the circumstances of the time and all the food references that pertain to that particular time as I passed through his life, and also the recipes that would have been used. So we don't necessarily know the exact recipes that the MacDonald family used, except in a few cases. Lady MacDonald, his second wife, kept a cookbook, so we do have her recipes. But I looked at things like, in the second chapter, which is called Boyhood of Fishtail, and this is a kind of I don't know if everybody knows this story, but young MacDonald, he was 8 years old, family were living in Hay Bay. They'd moved from Kingston to Hay Bay. And John was out ambling one summer morning, and he came across a man who was fishing at the shore. Do you all know this story? This is my favorite MacDonald story. So this man was fishing at the shore, and John walks up and strikes out his hand and says, hello, I'm John A. McDonald. Like now, which is what he called himself from the beginning because there were so many Johns and so many McDonalds. And so the guy knew his full name, and John A. proceeds to tell this fisherman the whole story of his entire life, which, you know, he's only 8, but he's got a lot to say, he's verbose. And the man listens to him for a while, but he's just tired of the whole thing. So he turns his back on John, and casts his rod, and John grabs the biggest of his fish from his basket and runs for home. And the guy sees him, and he's shouting after him. He said, "You fool, I know your name, you know, I'll find your father." And anyway, years later, nothing happens. John runs home with the fish. His mother cooks it. And years later, John's making one of his first political speeches. Actually, this is very, very, I found this very funny. So, and this man stands up at the end of John's speech and says to him, okay, so this is in 1837, in the town hall in Adolphustown, Mr. Guy Casey was waiting for his opportunity. When his moment came, he rose and told the story of a young boy named John A. McDonald who once stole his fish and ran for home. Mr. Casey then demanded John A. publicly acknowledge his crime. The crowd turned expectantly to John A., who bowed his head solemnly and said, "Mr. Chairman and yeoman of Adolphustown, what my old neighbor has told you about the theft of his beautiful fish is absolutely true. I can recall as though it were yesterday how frightened I was at that unearthly yell of our good friend, which almost caused me to drop the fish so as to make better speed. But I managed to hold on to it when I saw he was not in pursuit. I was clean out of breath when I burst into the house and fell headlong with it onto the floor and gasped for breath as I told my father where I found it and that there were lots more like it where it came from. I humbly beg your pardon, Guy, and my only regret is that I can't steal another one like it here tonight and have it for breakfast in the morning. Mother said it was the finest black bass she ever cooked." So that was McDonald, who could do that. Anyway, so there's that. And then what I'm going to do, if it's okay with you, is a very quick reading from this book, and then we'll... Does that work?
Mm-hmm. Perfect.
So I changed tactics entirely here. And this book came out last September. And the story of writing this book was kind of interesting because I was home one late November morning in 2017. It was a Friday morning. My phone rang and I picked it up and a man says, "Hi, I'm John McIntyre from McIntyre Purcell Publishing, and I'm looking for someone to write a book of Ontario culinary history." And then he proceeded to tell me. I said, okay. So he said, "I've read Sir John's Table. It's not what I want, but I know what I want." So I said, okay. I listened to him for a while longer. And he said, "So would you be interested?" And I said, "No, I don't think so, thanks. I'm working on something else at the moment." And then there's absolute dead silence, because I was working on something else. And then he says, "So, do you get a lot of publishers calling you out of the blue?" And I was so stunned. I was like, no, you're right, actually. Oh my God, like I'm just like backpedaling in my head. What am I doing? And then he says, "How about we have this Friday?" He says, "It's Friday. How about we have this conversation again on Monday morning, and you can have a think about what you want to answer." And he said, "We'll pretend like this never happened." So I had the weekend to come to my senses. And when he called me, I was all like, I wouldn't even let him speak. I was like, "Yes, Mr. McIntyre, yes, Mr. McIntyre, yes." So, but my objection in the first place was I was working on something else and his timeline was very tight, and I didn't want to do another book on a very tight timeline, which I did. But anyway, and this is the result. So, as soon as I signed a contract with them, I started making a master list of what I wanted to cover in the province of Ontario, and I realized quickly the master list is huge because I wanted to look at all the groups that had immigrated here from the Loyalists. I wanted to look at Indigenous food if I could, without veering into cultural appropriation. Mm-hmm. But I wanted to look at the Mennonites, the Loyalists, the Amish, the early Germans, the early Brits, Scots, Irish, the Europeans, the Finns, all the waves of migration. And then I wanted to, I made this sort of for about 2 weeks I was making a master list of kind of food stories from Ontario, and the list was just expanding and expanding and expanding, and I was just like, how am I going to find the stories that go with these? And I was also thinking of regions like the north and the west of the province. So I did make a master list, and then I set out across the province, going to little local archives and talking to people. And I couldn't believe the stories that came out everywhere I went. It was actually quite remarkable. This is the intro. I'll read a little bit from the intro, and then we can talk a bit more about some of the things that cropped up when I was doing the research. In high school history class, I remember rote learning the dates of battles, the names of the early all-male, all-white explorers, and as the new nation of Canada began to emerge, the names of our first politicians. The only time I perked up was at the mention of pemmican, bannock, maple syrup, salt pork, or dried salted fish, or by how anyone survived winter without electricity, central heat, and indoor plumbing. I was fascinated not by colonial politics nor the battles fought, nor by the horrendous ransacking of land, which was scarcely referenced, but by how Indigenous peoples and settlers lived and survived, what they ate, where their food came from, the most crucial of details that were rarely mentioned. Backtrack a few years earlier, and I was a brand new Canadian, my family having just immigrated from England. Decades later, the thing I remember most clearly was the profound sense of longing for tastes of a life left behind, for the times I'd spent as a very young girl helping my beloved grandfather in his ancient Yorkshire kitchen, shelling peas, learning to knead bread dough, and roll out pastry for jam tarts, and watching the Yorkshire puddings rise in the oven on Sunday as the roast rested on the counter. Food was one of the most powerful changes in my life on arrival in Ontario. Suddenly, I was immersed in a world of Wonder Bread, corn on the cob, Pop-Tarts, burgers, and hot dogs. I learned very young that how we cook and what we eat, our food, is a powerful symbol of our culture, history, and identity, and one of our most meaningful connections to the past. Food is central to our history. Cooking, too. Cooking is what makes humans unique. It is the truly critical part of our history as a race, the thing that differentiates us from every other species. Cooking connects us to our past, to our bloodlines, and all the way back to our ancient human forebears, likely Homo erectus, whom it is thought started cooking 1.8 million years ago, forever changing the course of human destiny. Food is fundamental, the world's largest industry. Food and cooking are about our very survival as a species, and yet curiously, we've largely ignored our culinary history. Perhaps that's partly because, for centuries, except in the most exceptional circumstances, it was women who were keepers of food knowledge. It was women who got up and lit the fire in the hearth and toiled and stirred and cooked and baked, who fed babies and kept families alive. Women who put down food for long, hard winters and who fed communities through plagues and depressions, famines and wars. For the longest time, until the mid to late 1900s, it was women who did the vast majority of the cooking. The truth was, and still is, the preparation of food is no small task. That was especially so for the earliest settlers who had access to few ingredients, ate only what they could grow, gather, hunt, trade, or otherwise find locally and seasonally. Preserved as best they could given their limited means and even the vessels to do so, cooked on open hearths and made everything from scratch. In the earliest days, even the grain had to be hand ground for flour. Excuse me. They actually had to plant the grain. They had to clear the land and plant the grain, and then gather the grain, harvest the grain, grind the grain. And we didn't even have yeast yet. So, they were capturing wild yeast or using starters from either from distillery runoff or just from natural wild yeast. But we certainly didn't have tablets of yeast. So where were we here? Okay, so the preservation, preparation, and cooking of food was all-consuming, crucial, vital, life-sustaining work, every bit as important as farming, mining, politics, and the development of infrastructure, none of which really mattered without someone to prepare the food. These are the unsung stories of the women who went before us, our mothers, our aunts, our grandmothers and great-grandmothers and great-great-grandmothers and so on, of their talent, creativity, thought, care, relentless hard work, and incredible ingenuity. Food runs like a perpetual thread through the lives of generations of women, stretching back to a time we can no longer remember and forward to a time we cannot imagine. It was also women who wrote down the recipes, who wrote, compiled, and annotated cookbooks, who kept diaries with exquisite details of the food they prepared and ate, and who passed on the sacred knowledge, the special code. Little did they know they were quietly recording some of the most fundamental details of history. That is how we ate and lived and survived. And I think I'll hold it there. There's a whole lot more I could say, but I want to skip along. So a couple of the stories that really jumped out at me, and there are some phenomenal Ontario stories when it comes to food, like a lot of firsts here. And I haven't heard them talked about, so there was really interesting things to discover. Just for example, the first electric oven was invented in Ottawa. The world's first electric oven was invented and patented in Ottawa in, I think it was 1892. And there were no public electricity grids yet, so it was kind of useless invention because you couldn't, it wasn't yet useful. Electricity had been developed, but this Thomas Ahern, an Ottawa engineer, invented the oven because he wanted something more efficient in a hotel kitchen. That he frequented the hotel and started to get involved with delivering things to them, and he wanted a more efficient way to cook. So that was an Ottawa invention that was patented and still hasn't really been changed significantly from the very beginning. The first field of red fife wheat was planted in Ontario, and the reason why that's really important was because red fife wheat went on to be crossbred to produce marquis, and marquis wheat was the wheat that was planted across the prairies, and it was the wheat that made Canada the greatest wheat exporting nation in the world, the greatest wheat producing nation in the world, which was such a large driving part of the economy for such a long time. There's always little wonderful gems like the Macintosh apple. It was, as we all know now, that it was first discovered in the St. Lawrence Valley, just up the St. Lawrence. And the story of apples is staggering all by itself, because in the 1800s there were over 7,000 named varieties of apples grown in North America. We are down to fewer than 300, and of those 300, 15 make up 90% of the market share of apples. And of those 15, Red Delicious account for 1/3 of all apples produced and sold in North America. So we're talking about a staggering loss of biodiversity, from 7,000 basically to sort of 15. There's fewer than 300 varieties grown now. And I don't know if anyone's heard about this, but a story that's just breaking in the news and broke in The Economist a couple of weeks ago is that apple trees are dying en masse in North America, and nobody knows why. So, even the few varieties we have left are currently all threatened. It's pretty remarkable when you think about this was just over 100 years ago. It's not that long ago, and the change is so huge. So what I did was I traveled around the archives all over the province, and I also reached out on social media, and people came. I said, please share widely, because if there are great family histories of food, I would love to know. So I traveled and met some of those people, and I reached out also to religious groups and various different groups for old community cookbooks, and I went through all of this, and I spent a lot of time in the National Archives in Ottawa, and all the university archives. And there were 3 major old cookbook collections. One's the newest one's at Queen's. There's 2 huge ones, though. One is at the University of Toronto, and one's at the University of Guelph, where they've been collecting cookbooks and now have massive archival collections of old cookbooks. And those old cookbooks are so interesting. They were the earliest form of social media. This is what, because women contributed recipes for those cookbooks, and even in the 1800s, there were contributor cookbooks being done. And so you could see you could be in Windsor, Ontario, or in Chatham, and you could see what somebody was doing in Port Hope. And I think this is really interesting how, the knowledge spread, that this was, to me, this is so exciting that this is early social media. This is like women networking. Although there were some fantastic submissions by men too, so I can't say it was all women. So I looked at those. I looked at manuscript cookbooks, which are unpublished, so handwritten cookbooks in those collections, and they were absolutely beautiful. I actually have, in the slides, I have it in the book. There are many recipes that come from. I'll just talk about 1 or 2 of them, and then I think I'll shut up for a bit. But one of the first recipes I found, so it was in the Queen's collection, and I found there's a manuscript cookbook there, which is absolutely beautiful and so tragic. This is an example of one of those recipes, and we've just reproduced them in the book. This is for barm brack, which is an Irish bread, originally raised with yeast. This recipe calls for yeast, so we can date it because we know when yeast came into play. But eventually it was made with baking soda, so it would have been more akin to a soda bread. It's a studded fruit bread. But the reason why it's important in here is because the archivist in the Queen's collection could date from the handwriting and the ingredients that were used. She could date this to the 1840s. There was no name on the book, which to me was just this tragic thing to hold in your hands, this beautiful book and this incredible writing. It was just, the pages are just, they're gorgeous. They're absolutely gorgeous. But we don't know who it came from. All we know is that she was likely Irish, likely educated because she could write so beautifully, and probably came in the famine. So, you know, you're always kind of grasping at these details for why people came. And I started by talking about firsts. Ontario also had the biggest canning industry in Canada for the longest time, which was in Prince Edward County, and produced 1/3 of the canned goods for North America. But they were put out of business, I find this interesting, by American tariffs, because the Americans realized that the canned goods were coming in from the States. So, of course, they introduced tariffs. And okay. Anybody got a question?
I do. When they came over on the boats that you were speaking of at the beginning, what did they eat? Like, did they bring food with them when they
did
came
bring
on board?
food, and actually get into that because so I divide those chapters into the kind of the knowledge, that we have in Sir John's case of his arrival. But his mother, there's some record of his mother having brought. She brought shortbread for sure. We know that's one of the things, and cheese.
Okay.
So they did bring whatever they could get on board, but of course for 9 weeks, right? And they have a space that's,
And no refrigeration or
nothing. Yeah. So they're bringing, in most cases, maybe bannock, maybe some sort of bread for the first few days, but they probably had a wheel of cheese because there were a lot of them. There was 4, 5, 6, 7. There was 9 of them between the grandmother and the grandmother nearly didn't make it. Like, she was terribly sick at sea and yeah, horrible circumstances.
And when they came down the river, would someone have been supplying food to them when they stopped for the night, or is that just go and pick your berries and
probably
good
the
luck to you?
captain would have organized food and would have organized for, he would know the route and know where he was coming, so he would have organized for there to be fresh meat or fish. This was a constant struggle. Food was just an incredible struggle. We think it's complicated now. It's so easy. It's so easy. If you had to spend a week living, we wouldn't survive. They didn't even have mason jars, right? They didn't get invented till 1858. So, there's you think of the things like the tin can industry, the tinning industry, or cans. The early industry was just, it was notoriously dangerous because the first thing they ever canned were, put in tins actually, were oysters, and of course probably killed, all kinds of people. And in fact, it was safer. Oysters were a huge big deal in the 1800s. So much so that the eastern seaboard was like the cod moratorium. They fished the eastern seaboard completely. They depleted all of the oysters. They were incredibly popular. Like everybody, it was de rigueur to serve oysters at all kind of special meals. But they were popular in taverns and restaurants and pies and they cooked them every which way you can think of. But actually fished the beds dry. But I thought, how the heck did they get? I had to do a whole pile of research to try and figure out how oysters came, because you see them on the menus. There's a couple of menus in the book, in the Sir John's book, from dinner parties that he had. Because he was a prime minister, we have those things were preserved. So you would see, of course, there's a couple of courses usually in between 18 and 25 courses at a dinner. For those big dinners, there'd be a couple of oyster courses, and they'd be served in different ways, but they always started with oysters. They would have oyster soup, then there would be other kinds. And I thought, how did they get all the oysters inland for New Year's Day levees in Ottawa? And it turns out they packed them in barrels in sand and poured salt water over them and then shipped them and we're able to keep the oysters alive. So this oyster carting was a big business. I think, I don't even know if I answered your question or if I just rambled.
The question is, socioeconomically, why were they in the bottom rung of people crossing over?
McDonald's, they were
Yeah.
absolutely impoverished.
Okay.
So Hugh McDonald, John A's father, was a shopkeeper in Scotland and had a run of failed businesses. The presumption is that he was an alcoholic. He had the gift of the gab, but nothing else. He had no business plan in life, and of course, like so many immigrants came because they were poor, because there was the promise of more in Canada or in Australia or wherever they chose to go to. And there was, like in the early years, there were land grants, so that enticed a lot of people to come. But when they arrived in Kingston, Hugh McDonald set up a shop, and it promptly failed. He set up a shop actually on Store Street, which is now Princess Street. And that shop failed, and then he opened another, and that failed, and then they moved to Hay Bay. So he has this legacy of failed businesses. His only intelligent business plan in life was to get John A. to law school. That was the thing that saved the entire family, because John A. went to law school at 16. And it really saved the family. They would be, they would have had nothing if it weren't for. And I think his mother is so fantastic, because his mother from day one is such a great mother to all of those children, and to Maria, the orphaned cousin, and she believes in those kids like they're nothing else. And she says, mark my words, John A. will make more than the ordinary man, over and over and over. And I think if you grow up with that, you're going to believe that. It was really formed. But one of the things that we talk about, when we talk about John A. and all the things that went wrong, but he was a remarkably loving man. He was so good to his children, and his second child was born with hydroencephalopathy, and she was terribly sick her entire life. And he loved her and thought she was a princess. And she would have been very disfigured and, quite crippled, was unable to do almost anything for herself. He wrote to her, so all the letters are in the files. The letters are beautiful. There's a side to him that we don't talk about. And he was very human. And I think, from, maybe it's a female perspective, but I think his mother had such a huge role in that. Yes?
I have two things that I'm thinking about as you're speaking. When you came from England, did your mother have problems with baking? I remember I did the same thing. My mother, what she would bake with in England didn't work here. It had to do with altitude or something. And she couldn't bake from, I think she had a Mrs. Beaton's cookbook.
Oh yes,
and
I got my mother's.
And I don't have mine anymore, but I have a fish slice that came from England, but she said it didn't work when we first came here. Like what she was used to baking with didn't
the
work.
Ingredients are so different. I agree.
And things didn't rise. Or
yes, the Yorkshire puddings were never the same again. The wheat's quite different. They use hard and soft wheat still in Britain, and we don't do that here. So
maybe that's what it was.
Yeah,
there was self-raising, and then there was regular flour. And the other thing I'm thinking of is I'd love to hear a conversation between you and Margaret Visser.
Oh, I'd love that too. I reference her in all of my work. Yeah, thank you. That's lovely. But you've learned to bake with North America, because I love baking.
Oh, well, I didn't go near a kitchen when I was a teenager. It was like, I actually said to my mother one day, because she would say, I was the person that if we got boy toys from my brother at Christmas, I'd take them over. And all I would do is maybe do the dishes or scoop out the bowl after she'd baked. I wasn't a kitchen person or cook person till middle age. But I remember actually arguing with my mother and standing in the kitchen, and she called, we were having a family dinner, and she said, come in the kitchen and help me. And I'm thinking, just because I don't have a penis, I have to help you?
So whereas I wanted to be in the kitchen helping, it's so interesting.
Oh, I do now.
I'll share my Mrs. Beaton's with you. Yes.
Sorry, I'll probably get this answer by reading the book, which I haven't yet, and I will. It's very interesting. But so was Sir John A. Particularly interested in food, other than just kind of staying full? Like, did he, did he attempt to put a kind of a food spin on, the beginning of Canada, or try to define food
I
in any
make
way?
the point over and over and over in this book that he really does that incredibly well. So there's one point in the book where we're headed towards Confederation, and I'm going back in my memory here because I wrote this in 2014 or 2015. So there's 4 provinces that were in Confederation before Confederation, and those 4 provinces were Upper and Lower Canada, and Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, and Lord Howe of Nova Scotia was threatening all the time to pull out. He was not a happy camper in the Commonwealth and in the group, and he kept saying he was done. And at one point, he sent a delegation to Britain to try and withdraw. So of course, Macdonald sent his own delegation to compete with that. But in the meantime, he and his wife, Macdonald and his wife, invited Lord and Lady Howe to dinner. And at this point, Macdonald was living in Earnscliffe in Ottawa, which is now the British High Commission. The British High Commission actually bought it years and years ago when it went for sale, and it's been the home of the British High Commissioner ever since. So they invited them to dinner in Ottawa and had a very sort of lovely home dinner party, which, it's not a formal banquet, but they invited them and maybe a couple of other guests, and they wooed them with a roast duck dinner and all kinds of lovely wine and champagne. And so I do have a chapter in here called The Roast Duck Dinner that saved the Dominion, because after that dinner, Howe backed off. And I think it's a really interesting point that feed someone, feed them, not if you cook with them and share food with them, it breaks down all kinds of barriers. So the next day, Howe was back in Confederation, called off his delegation, and Britain had already said without 4 parties they wouldn't ratify the agreement, they wouldn't ratify the British North America agreement. So in a way, it's true that roast duck dinner saved the Dominion, and then the other provinces followed on. But he knew the power of food, Macdonald, for sure, and alcohol, of course. But there's many times where he entertains. And on all his campaign trails, he has this very good friend, Eliza Grimison, who's a lifelong friend, and there's been all this speculation about whether or not they had an affair. But I think it's sort of ridiculous, because if it was an affair, it was so brazen, because she would walk into a room and he would stop everything and get up and hug her and give her a kiss. So I don't think they would have done that if it was an illicit affair. It seemed like a really genuine friendship. And the story of Eliza Grimison is that she owned a pub. She owned the old Royal Hotel or Royal Tavern on Princess Street in Kingston. And she often supplied him with food and alcohol. But she was a widow, and one of the only respectable things a widow could do was run a tavern. Like, there weren't jobs for women in those days, so she could do that. That was one of the jobs open to, because it was deemed as cooking, right? She would have, been in the kitchen there. But she actually owned the place. And why am I telling you this story? Oh, because on his campaign trail, he always had huge picnics. So he plied all the voters with food. They would have whiskey barrels and all kinds of, and whiskey was 25 cents a gallon. It was essentially the same price as water from water carters. And they plied everybody with food and alcohol, and of course, were able to swing votes. And he did this all over, wherever he could travel to. But Eliza often supplied all the food because she was far wealthier than him. And she also had a white carriage and white horses, so she drove him around in that. So she was quite a character. There's all these great women behind the scenes that we just never talk about. And the rabble rousers and the unsung people in history. I really love those.
Were women voting then?
Not till 1929.
I think it's just, I said that, but that's when we officially became known as persons.
Oh.
But it's actually earlier than that. So if you look, if anybody has Google, I think it's 1906 or 1907, but women didn't vote.
No.
But we did, and actually Macdonald was the first leader in the world to propose the vote for women, but it was voted down in the House of Commons. But it's 1929 when we officially become recognized as women.
People.
People. Because the famous five who went to England and
Did he have favorite food, favorite meal that he
Oysters.
always requested?
Oysters. There's a little story in here about oysters, actually. So Is it okay if I read a little bit more?
Go right ahead.
Okay, okay. I just don't want to bore you all to death. Can you keep an eye on time for me to let me know?
I can bring the boat back.
Okay, so this comes from a chapter called The Hopes of the Nation Hang on Half an Oyster. And this is 1869 to 1870, so we are post-Confederation. And this, I don't know what's going on here. We've got a bunch of stuff happening. I know that half the problem, there's negotiating with various lands to come in, and there's all kinds of issues. I mean, still, the Americans are still trying to buy the Northwest Territories. And anyway, on May 6, 1870, Macdonald was in his office in the East Block on Parliament Hill when Hewitt Bernard, his assistant, heard a crash. He entered Macdonald's office and found the Prime Minister in convulsions, writhing on the floor, his pulse almost undetectable. In the hours that followed, it appeared that Macdonald was dying. A telegram was dispatched to Hugh John to let him know about his father's condition. The pain was so severe that Macdonald did not even recognize Agnes, so that's his second wife, who rushed to be at his side. A doctor was summoned, morphine was administered, John A. was diagnosed with gallstones. Gallbladder surgery was not yet a possibility, so those suffering with acute cholecystitis, a blocked and swollen gallbladder, and forgive my pronunciation if there are any doctors in the room, had no choice but to endure the pain and hope the gallstones would pass. For a month, John A. he remained in his office on Parliament Hill, now converted to a sick room. They couldn't move him. He was so sick. I mean, it was just assumed he was going to die. And infected gallbladder would kill you in that era.
It still can.
It still can, true, that's true, good point. In the meantime, Parliament adjourned, but not before the Manitoba Act had proceeded and the royal assent was received. Was quickly received. Hugh John came to visit visit John. Agnes, who despaired of John A.'s drinking, took to rubbing her husband's chest and face with whiskey to soothe him. Even the Globe, and there's a long-standing, John Brown was the editor of the Globe, and they're long-standing rivals, so the Globe just attacked him all the time. Even the Globe softened its attacks and reported that Sir John was, quote, very low. There were genuine fears and concerns the nation might lose its leader, and public sympathy was high. Dr. James Grant, John A.'s physician, put Macdonald on a diet of poached white fish and milk and reminded him of how ill he'd been and how risky it would be to overindulge. He told John A. that he could have just half an oyster as a special treat. Remember, Sir John, said Dr. Grant, the hopes of Canada are now depending on you. It seems strange, replied John A., that the hopes of Canada should depend on half an oyster. So even sick, he's still funny.
Was he overweight?
No,
No,
gosh, no, he
no,
was
he's so
lean,
thin.
wiry.
What year was that?
That was 18, well, it was just right after Confederation, so 1869, 1870. So, yeah, he loved food. He talks about food a lot. In his letters home, so he goes to England several times during his life and reports back to his mother in letters that have been kept. And the letters are all full of, Mother, you wouldn't believe the great breakfast I just ate, and he'll go on with the details. So the lovely thing about that is we have this record of the food, that he's kept for us. And he was a great person for feeding others, which I think is one of the loveliest things. Yes?
In the States, I think it was President Jefferson said, without food sovereignty, you have no democracy.
That's fantastic. I'm going to look that up. I love that. Thank you.
Was there a similar type of awareness in Canada at the early stages?
I've never heard anything quite that direct.
It's so true.
But it is so true, isn't it? I mean, when you look at when things fell apart for Macdonald during the starvation of the Plains Indians, and now, of course, the backlash is about that. So, I did write about the starvation of the Plains Indians because it's a little-known fact that the Liberal opposition were petitioning for even less to be sent to the Plains. They wanted the supplies cut off, and it's all recorded. It's there because everything in Parliament was recorded, so you can see the record. I just think it was the times. There was, we're so much smarter now. We think we are.
Well, that's why the bison were all killed off.
When the bison were all killed.
That wasn't just game hunting, that was starved Indians. That was awful.
Well, it was horrendous, absolutely horrendous. And I certainly, I covered it. I mean, the slaughtering of the bison wasn't to starve the Indians, it was for sport. And the remarkable thing about that was, so I wrote an article on this, and I have to check my facts because it's so staggering. I always think this can't be right. The bison were believed to have been the biggest population of large wild animals on the planet, once numbering an estimated 50 million.
Yeah.
And then they were decimated, absolutely. That was sport hunting.
That was the sort of public view. Come sport hunt, but there's always a story behind
Well, I
the story.
suppose there
behind the
is.
story.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah. The result, the same, regardless. I mean, the indigenous people of the plains were starved because that was their major food supply, and they use bison for everything, for clothing, for. So yeah, horrendous. It's a horrendous story, and it's really important we don't forget it. So I mean, I look back and I think it's so bad, but I also think, wow, we're so culpable when it comes to the environment. plastic, the ruination of the earth. So every generation, and you just think, well, how can we be so dumb? Have we not evolved further than this? Anyway, that's such a depressing topic. Let's leave that quickly. Sorry, yes.
Yeah, and I think it relates more to your book on Ontario that, and I was just sitting here nodding, yes. And, does everyone know you can get red Fife flour up at... the
Delta Mill.
Well, yes, the Delta Mills, and also at the organic milk place up on the road to Sydenham.
Oh,
yeah,
right.
I can't remember the name.
Limestone Creamery.
Limestone Creamery, thank you.
Right.
Yeah. But in that whole topic and in your comments just now, how do we as a society of people make sure that the next generations coming up have this awareness of the complex and very interesting history of food, and especially as more people get busier and busier, more and more takeout, so they lose that tactile kind of contact with it. So have you reflected on that at all? Any good ideas?
Because that's how I make my living, such as it is. So I mean, it's absolutely true, but I think there is really growing awareness about how important food is. I mean, food is the world's largest industry, and it's the way we make the biggest impact on the planet, and I think there's increasing recognition of that.
Mm-hmm.
Let's hope. Yes.
Well, just in light of, you had mentioned the Queen's display with the old cookbooks. I was there when they unveiled that, and it was my cousin's daughter. It was one of her teachers in the history department, and that was their focus or seminar, and each one of them had to review one of the cookbooks, and they did presentations on it.
Mm-hmm.
It was fascinating.
It is fascinating.
It was fascinating, and what these kids came up with. They were first or second year history students, and it's like I didn't go to I went to college. I didn't go to Queen's, but it's like an actual course.
Oh yeah,
it's an actual course.
Culinary history is rapidly.
I ended up donating a bunch of old books that I had, cookbooks that I had, because it's so valuable. It's like obviously Queen's has the archives, but now they're archiving food. Really, it's a real serious, not business, but it's not a hobby to them. And it was like the kids were marked on it, and the presentations that they gave were enlightening. Mm-hmm. But and one of them was the Laura Secord cookbook, which, I knew the history behind that one because I'm trained in food, and one of the placements that we had, the lady worked on weekends to produce that Laura Secord cookbook, and was with the Canadian Home Economics Association.
It's a great book.
And there's a Wolf Island souffle in that.
Oh,
that's how come,
nice.
and I brought that to the attention at Humber College back in the 70s. So there's a Wolf Island souffle in that book.
There is this huge growing awareness, and I one of the, I think I'm probably over time, but one of the things I have to say about the cookbooks, I just love them. I just revere those old cookbooks. And
it was really well
one
done.
of the things that I learned was that earlier, so late 1700s, early 1800s, especially on the land, especially poor settlers, might have 2 books, a Bible and a cookbook. And girls, not so much boys, but girls learned literacy and numeracy through the cookbooks.
Mm-hmm.
And when I saw these stories about that, about mothers teaching their children 3 eggs, teaching and how they learned to read and they learned their numbers this way. I just thought, this is so touching. Like, you can just imagine these lives before us, and I think it's really important not to lose that.
So in the winter, when the women were preparing meals every day, what were the men doing? Yeah, like eating
Working
in the winter?
But well, many of them, yeah,
I guess they're
absolutely.
chopping
Like
wood.
chopping wood and hauling wood and.
They didn't cook though.
No, I mean, it was very rare. Like, unless there's one story in this book. What time? Are we okay?
We're okay.
Okay, so
Absolutely.
okay.
You can bring the
So if
book
anybody
back.
has to leave, if anybody has to leave, please don't feel badly getting up and going. I don't
The
want
wheels
to
on
keep
it.
anybody.
Our door's locked.
Okay. So don't even try. So there's one story in here that relates to that. This story is called Settling the North. And I found this story, I'm going to tell the whole story of this because this actually became personal for me, but I had no idea that it was going to. So this story is about a man called Ignatius Ned Hummel, who was born in 1855 and lived to 1941. And he originally lived in New Germany, which was Waterloo, Waterloo was originally New Germany. And he moved to the north because he didn't have land in the Waterloo region, but they were starting to open up the north. And when in these days the north was North Bay because they didn't go much further. There were settlements. Thunder Bay was a settlement. Fort Francis actually, and Port Arthur were settlements, and there were settlements across once the railway went in. But they were so remote that settlers hadn't really moved up. They had specific populations, often Finns that had gone to live up there. But they were starting to survey the land around just south of North Bay. And so Ned Hummel became one of the first settlers. In fact, I think he was the first settler in a township called South Hemsworth, which is one of the first townships south of North Bay. So he moved up there with his wife and 3 children. There were no roads. There was no villages. There was nothing. He had 100 acres of land that he'd been allocated because it had been surveyed, and he was basically clearing the trees in this boggy, rough land so he could farm. And his wife died in pregnancy with the 4th child. So he left him with this uncleared land and 3 small children. Later he marries again, and his second wife has 14 children. So now they have 17 children. So, and this is just a little bit about Ned Hummel. For the first few years, the closest grocery store was 12 miles away in Commanda. Ned walked there to buy groceries, which he carried home on his back, making a 24-mile round trip. Once he went to buy flour, only to find there was none available. So he kept walking all the way to Nipissing, another 4 hours through dense bush, through forest, swamps, black flies, and mosquitoes, on a road that was little more than a rough path over hills and rocky outcrops and across streams. And when he finally arrived in Nipissing, there was no flour in that store either. All he wanted was something nice for his 2 little girls to spare them from the rough diet the family were existing on, likely salt pork and root vegetables. The only thing the shopkeeper could offer was soda biscuits, so he bought those and made the 62-kilometer round, 38.5 mile, 62-kilometer round trip back home. So I found this story in the archives in Powassan, Ontario. Later, of course, the railway comes through the north. The Grand Trunk Railway is the first comes through, and the little area that he's in, which is now known as Trail Creek, temporarily became a boom town called Little Chicago because when the railway stopped there, 3 taverns popped up right away, and apparently it was so rough and so wild that there were murders in the tavern every week, every weekend, and every time there was payday, there was in the woods there, yeah, and survived. And the thing is, death was just a part of life. Like if you lost children, it was almost assumed, you would have that many children because you needed them to clear the land and do the work.
Wow.
Anyway, I think I've said more than enough.
We could listen to you all afternoon. I mean it.
And then I'd see you start to
I wouldn't.
Anyway, thank you very much for having me and for listening to me. I appreciate it.
We can't thank you enough. You put a face on Sir John A. that I've never seen. I've been to talks about our first Prime Minister. I've never seen him presented so human. And especially at this time when he is being put through the ringer washer.
He was actually an extraordinary human. I mean, he did things wrong, we all do. But
Oh, yeah.
But he was actually, you know, he's a great father, an incredible father.
Yeah.
And he had a gift for everybody said this. He had a gift for friendship, which is, I want to be remembered for having a gift for friendship. What an incredible thing.
Yeah.
Anyway,
We discovered his grave when we were kids. A few schoolmates and I were up the Cattarauqua Cemetery, came across this stone. It had just snowed, and the one kid said, "Do you think anybody knows?" I don't know. It's a long time ago. Maybe nobody knows this is here. Wow. Ooh. Carry that with me. Thank you very much. Cookbooks. My father's mother we still have it all in a scribbler. Violet Johnson, Violet Greenwood, who God was a magnificent cook. Everything was done out here on the farm. You made it all, brought it all back to everyone from her time and before. No, thank you very much.
Thank
Lindy.
you. And I should just say, because, Kathy, where are you?
Here.
Sorry, I'm so sorry. I knew that, and yet Kathy has made cookies for us.
Yes.
And they are actually from, I think there's two from out of Old Ontario Kitchens.
Yeah.
One is my mother's ginger shortbread from Yorkshire, which was passed on to her by her mother. And the other is Cree Bannock, which my mom was fascinated by Indigenous culture. And in her late 70s, she did a girlfriend trip. And her friends they took the Polar Bear Express and went to the end of the line and stayed in Moose Factory. And on that trip, she acquired this recipe, and I know it was typical in her handwriting that, you know, she'd said nothing about it. But anyway, that's my mother's recipe or what she inherited for Cree Bannock. And I think there's some other cookies back there
there's
as
another.
well. Yes, so, and there seems to be tea and coffee.
Yeah.
And I have books, and just so you know, so you're not guessing, and no pressure whatsoever. So John's Table is $20 and there's no tax. And I have a few copies of both, and there's Out of Old Ontario Kitchens is $25. But please do not feel obliged.
Thank you.
Thank you again.